yes, I'm in this shirt again. I'm recording this video straight after I recorded a video about the teas that I'm enjoying at the moment. Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in August. This morning I went to the journal in which I write all of the books. And this morning I discovered that I hadn't put 3 books in here. Indeed, there may be more books that I forgot to write down because that's the type of person that I am. And unfortunately, if I don't write them down, I forget about them. Such as the fact that I forgot that I read After Sappho in September. So in here, it's written before a book that I read in August. And if you didn't understand how much that upsets me, then you don't know me at all. Anyway, a lot of August was spent reading the book along list in preparation for the shortlist, of which Charlie of Charlie Brooke and I managed to surmise 5 out of the 6, predict 5 out of the 6, and if you haven't watched that video already, then you really ought to. I talk about Charlie a lot on this channel. It's just another way of reminding you about my name, because the only guest stars I ever have seem to have the same name as me. The first book that I read in August was Case Study by Graeme McRae Burnett. We have this man. Was he Braithwaite? Was he Collins Braithwaite? Was this that book? So somebody's receiving these journals meant to be attributed to a case about this unethical psychologist back in the 60s, and then we get talk from this character who takes on the name of Rebecca and invents an identity in order to figure out how her sister came to kill herself many years before. However, the entire thing that Graeme McRae Burnett is doing within the narrative is he's creating fictions upon fictions, and this is an author who's very much into the metafiction, and indeed the previous book that I read by this author, The Accident on the A35, I ended up having the same problem with when it came to Case Study, in that I very much enjoyed the writing and the way in which the story was going, only to feel betrayed by the ending and the way that it ended up going, because I felt like he didn't land the ending. I don't necessarily think that there always has to be a build-up before you either let the reader down, which I was, or you do this almost explosive ending, or you do a rather subtle ending. This one didn't really seem to do anything. It seemed to go on and then just cut off. It was almost like the moment they talk about in The Sopranos where the screen went black. It felt like you might be getting answers, and Graeme, the author, might be there twirling his moustache a little bit. In the grand scheme of things, I just liked the writing, and I thought that we were getting somewhere with the characters, and I really thought that I was going to end up adoring this book, and I didn't because I just felt like he failed to land the ending, and I understand what he was trying to do with the book, but I just don't think that he achieved it. Next, I read It's All in the Blood by Carol J. Forrester. I swapped An Heir to Murder for a copy of this book when the poet came to a Poems and Pints a few months ago. Indeed, I believe that the poet is going to be our guest in November. These poems discuss Carol's upbringing on a farm. They also get into mythology. They discuss what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a mother. It discusses family ties. I have to say that I gelled more with the farming poems and the poems that mention mythology. The reason I say this is because they are also somewhat in keeping with the poetry that I have been writing, so it was nice to see other writers doing something that you're trying to do. I like the way that the poet managed to adapt some of the Grecian myths here, and the way that she brought them into the poetic form and used her own voice to tell them. I think this is a collection in which the poet is giving you their idea of the world, and they're doing this with using, in some places, great assonance, which is one of my favourite poetic forms, even though to some it might seem a bit simple. I always like thinking about the way in which language sounds when it's on the page, and I like thinking about the way in which poetry is going to be performed, and I have seen some of these poems performed before, so I can tell then what the poet was going for in their own style. I think this poetry collection did what the author set out to do. It showed the type of poet we have here. We got to see who she is as a person, as a poet, and what her poetic, not necessarily ethos or manifesto is, but we get to see an entire range of what she is going to be talking about in her poems in future. And I think as a debut collection, it is a strong one. Then we have The Man Who Died Twice by Richard Osman. This was a buddy read with Dane over at Dane Reads, and I had to read this quickly because I was reading the book of books and I had so much on. So I started it on the Thursday. I think I read it over that weekend, or that day actually. It's not a very taxing book, is The Man Who Died Twice. Richard Osman is writing... Okay, this is my issue with Richard Osman's books. They are marketed as though they are doing something extremely new and fantastic within the genre of cosy crime, and they are not doing that. These are standard cosy crime novels that, if they had been written by anybody else, would not be receiving the acclaim that they are doing. And unfortunately, they aren't even the best books within that genre. There is so much more that is so much better than this. Within cosy crime, there is, as with a lot of fiction, there is this case that you have to suspend your disbelief for a certain amount of time. And unfortunately, I couldn't do that with this book. I am all for including older characters within your fiction. I do it all the time. That's what the Doris books are, and I'm by no means comparing the two. But with the Thursday Murder Club, there was a sense of believability about that, but that got thrown out of the window entirely with this book. Yes, I thought that it was good that the author had chosen to talk about some of the darker, bleaker aspects of what it means to grow older, when Imran, who is only just managing to come out of his shell, ends up being attacked. But the way in which the author chose to deal with this, in almost a humorous way, with the band all coming together, and the resolution to that storyline felt very forced, felt very trite, and just felt like it couldn't happen at all. And it had this level where this book almost felt like a caricature of itself. It almost felt like none of this could happen. Now, of course, maybe Osman knows that. Maybe that is what he's playing on. Maybe now that he's got a film contract, he wants to have something extremely outrageous happen in the sequel. But quite honestly, none of this landed for me. It's an incredibly fast read, but in terms of reading books about older characters in a retirement home, I would much rather spend my time with the characters from the Sunset Grove series by Mina Lundgren than spend them in this book and in this series. And yes, I'm not going to lie, I will probably read the next book in the series because it's a fast-paced read, but there is nothing really propelling me to read it. It's one of those where now I think I'll just wait for it to turn up in the charity shop and it can be a one and done type book, because there is, like it says here, full of humour and heart. I can definitely see the humour. And I think that Osman really might want to strive to show some heart in these books. As crime fiction, as cosy crime fiction, it just doesn't work for me. The characters, just everything they were doing felt too outrageous, and I didn't get on with it. I couldn't suspend my disbelief enough for this book, and there were so many eye-rolling moments with this one, especially when it came to almost the predictability of everything that went on in this. Somebody gets in touch with Elizabeth after many years, and Osman takes you down one route to think that it might be going one way, and then decides to throw in a twist at the end and then throw in another twist to try and throw you off the scent. It's bloated, it doesn't need to be this long, it's not that well done, and it's just not that good. Then we have Glory by NoViolet Bulawayo. This is a book that I was looking forward to a lot. This is a book in which every single one of the characters is an animal, and I believe that it is discussing the fall of Mugabe's regime in Zimbabwe. This is a book in which I'm conflicted. So I was very much looking forward to this because I liked We Need New Names when I read it 9 years ago, and that was a piece of adult fiction. I hadn't really read that much adult fiction before, but there is a turning point in that book I always go back to that felt incredibly cinematic, and I had this sensation that I never had when reading before, and I found that marvellous. So when I discovered this book, when Leo and Sarah and I met up in Manchester a few months ago, I was shocked because I had no idea this book was coming out, and days before I'd been wondering when I'd next see a book by the author. So it was just all of these serendipitous things coming together. And when this book got longlisted for the Booker and now it's shortlisted, I was thrilled both times. However, this book did take me a long time to get into. It was 150 pages of noise and chaos and just all these people shouting at each other and a lot of repetition, and I wondered whether this was intentional by the author to show how chaotic the world is feeling to the people here. I did similar to The Man Who Died Twice. I had an eye roll moment when a cat and a sheep are talking to one another when another character has come and taken over the country, Judada, with a da and another da. And this came from the fact that the sheep is incredibly pious and incredibly religious and is going to follow the people blindly, and I thought you really had to have her be a sheep here. And the cat reminded me of the cat from The Master and Margarita. It felt a bit on the nose, but it was only at that point that I began to think, okay, maybe the animals are going to mean something and are going to symbolise something. But for me, I do think that you could have transposed all of these animal characters into human characters, because they didn't really seem to have any animalistic tendencies. Sometimes she wouldn't use the terminology of hoof or paw, she'd always go with like hands or feet, and it didn't feel natural. And I feel like I would have preferred the animals to be more animalistic and more brutal, and because you have all of these animals and you have these animal behaviours and you have an entire animal kingdom there. And when we're discussing that kingdom, then maybe you could have, the people you were discussing, you could have given them attributes to the animals or maybe gone into some sort of symbolism there. But it just seemed like she was just making them animals for the sake of it. So it didn't matter what the animal was because they didn't really behave like animals. Like, when I think about this book and I think about one of the major protagonists that comes into it, I don't immediately think, oh, that person was a goat. I think of them as a person, and I can envisage them in my mind as a person. And I think in terms of themes and motifs and all that, and what the author was wanting to talk about, that maybe it was done better in the film Zootopia by Disney. I'm left conflicted because I really like Bulawayo's writing and her prose, and after the page 150 mark I was very much invested in this story and flew through the final 300 pages or so. But I also think that so much more work needed to be done because I don't see the need for these characters being animals. I don't think they added anything to the story. It's been a while since we have seen the hooded blanket, but editing Charlie here to say as the video cut out 6 minutes after I was talking to you, so lost the final thoughts on Glory by NoViolet Bulawayo. But basically it's been a fortnight since I recorded this video and I am still feeling the same way. I very much appreciated Bulawayo's prose after the 150 page mark, and I think there are some very brutal scenes in the final 300 or so pages, but I'm not sure that it makes up for the chaos at the beginning that make it very difficult for a reader to find any sort of way into the world. Yes, you get a sense of the world, this chaos and this noise, but it doesn't really go any further than that until the 150 page mark, where this character is introduced and you find out why this character left the country many years before. However, this character is mentioned in the blurb, and for her not to appear for such a long time, I don't think that it suited the narrative. As I say, I don't believe there was any need for these characters to be animals. I think that the author was trying to play it safe and to avoid having to do much research into the real lives of the people that she was trying to create allegory for, so she could do whatever she wished to the characters because they were all animals, just referencing a few real life events. And I think that as well there is an element of satire to the book, but I think that there's too much going on to really pay much attention to that. At points I marvelled at the writing, and I was very much enthralled by the way this book ended, and those final 300 pages, but part of me is still conflicted because for the most part I noticed too many of the inconsistencies and too many of the things that I didn't particularly care for when it came to Glory. Next, I talked about Tomb of Sand by Geetanjali Shree, translated by Daisy Rockwell, and I read this book as part of a read-along hosted by Sarah over at Hardcover Hearts, which was a very good way to get more out of this book. This book begins with a woman who returns home and subsequently falls into a deep depression that sees her not wish to leave her bed. In the meantime, we're getting to see how the family react to this and how they try to get her to recognise that there is something to live for. In doing so, recognise that they also maybe don't know everything about their mother and their grandmother as they believed. And I'd say that this is a almost alternative take on a family saga. And I say that in that usually with a familial saga, you start at the beginning and you go straight through to the end, picking up with various people's lives throughout the narrative. Here, all the information is thrown at you piecemeal, and you seem to be in this tundra, really, and all of these different narrators are coming at you and all these different stories are coming at you, and you have to remember them as you try and piece together all of these people's lives. But the prose is written with such eloquence, and I find it startling that the translator has managed to recreate the playfulness that Shree has in the original novel. There is a great wealth of language within here to marvel over, and the way in which language is used was particularly inspiring to me because I love to see the ways in which language can be played with, and not just in a poetic fashion, but also in the ways in which it's used for narrators, because sometimes you'll have human narrators, sometimes you'll nip into a cracked Buddha, sometimes you're a bird. I also appreciated what this book says about the partition in India and the way in which it discusses displacement. And I'd say that it's almost a reverse narrative, in that, or maybe it's actually not a reverse narrative when we think about it in terms of real life experiences. And it's not until we lose the selfishness that we have as younger people that we begin to start to piece together the lives of our older relatives. Now, I come from this family that's constantly telling and retelling its stories, so I know a lot about my older relatives and have talked about how I have stories dating back 150 years for people that I don't even know. But here, it isn't until the latter stages of the book that the characters begin to recognise who their mother might have been before they knew her themselves. I think it is a great look at the ways in which relationships within a family work. And I was just particularly impressed by this, and also very grateful to Sarah for the read-along because of all of the experiences and all of the notes that people brought into the conversation that helped me understand parts of the book that I might not have understood had I been reading this on my own. Anyway, I think that's all I need to talk about, so let's return to Charlie from a few weeks back, who is rather dismayed that he's just lost 6 minutes worth of footage. There is a bounciness and a playfulness to this book, despite the fact that it is talking about such serious topics such as depression, gender non-conforming people at times, and the way in which they are treated in the country in which this book is set, and the partition, which it seems from the narrative actually happened many years before this book, but is still very fresh in our protagonist's memory. Indeed, there is a lot at the latter portion of this book as to what makes a person. Where does a person come from? Is it the place in which they have lived their entire life that has moulded them, or is it the place that they have been born but are unable to return to for whatever reason? And I think that the author handles these topics incredibly well, but sometimes the reason I say this book bears rereading is because it's very easy to get lost in the playfulness of this language. It can be like a maze at sometimes in the way that it jumps about, a labyrinth even. And I think that that is one of the reasons that it bears rereading, and I rather enjoyed the playfulness of it, and I rather enjoyed how fast a reading experience this actually was. Despite the fact that it is a rather huge tome, when you sit down and read it, it goes by in a flash. It's a breeze of a book to read, and that means that sometimes things do pass you by rather quickly. And I do wonder whether on each time you return to this book, whether you might not notice more, whether it might not be an ever-changing narrative simply due to whatever you're bringing to the book each time you read it. I don't know, but I really did think that it was superb. Then we have The Trees by Percival Leverett, another book that was longlisted for the Booker Prize and has now made it to the shortlist. Charlie and I read this one Sunday afternoon into the evening, and we found it a very fast-paced book. Personally, I think that it's a one-and-done type thriller, and reminded me somewhat of Elmore Leonard. I very much enjoyed the reading experience of this one. I do think that sometimes the author missed the mark, and that in the end, due to the fact that sometimes he was trying to make too many punchlines and too many jokes, that it might have overshadowed what he was trying to say was actually happening within the plot. However, I do think that he managed to discuss the topics he wished to discuss incredibly well, and gives the reader cause to think and mull over what he's talking about within his narrative. So here we have white men who are being murdered in a fashion that is reminiscent of Emmett Till, and this is set in Money, Mississippi. Indeed, this very much goes back into the lynching of Emmett Till in order to tell its narrative. Basically, at the scene of the crime where these white men are being murdered, a black man's corpse is also found. However, this body keeps going missing from the morgue, and there becomes this conversation as to whether it's something mystical going on. Now, I think, as has been mentioned by other people, that certain reviewers might have played up this idea of the mystical and the zombie a bit too much, because that doesn't really come into play in this novel. This is a novel which almost discusses retribution and revenge, and the ways in which this can be found, and the ways in which a certain president who does make an appearance in this book would respond if certain events like this did happen. It goes into the dehumanization of black people that has been inflicted on them by the people in power, and how certain people still have not changed their behaviours or refuse to step away from racist ideals which means that you could always be a hair's breadth away from having rights removed from you. And it can be an incredibly powerful thriller at points, and a novel which is almost suffused with depth. I can't say that word. It's a bit deep, is what I'm trying to say. But at the same time, because of how fast-paced and satirical and humorous this book can get at times, it almost feels like a joke is being made about all these things. But as with other books that have made it to the Booker shortlist, is it a case of this book also having more layers to it than the usual thriller, and making it a book that, because it's so fast-paced, it does bear going back and rereading? I don't know, because to me it did just seem like a straightforward thriller that I liked, and I liked what it was trying to say, but I'm not sure that it did it as well as it could have done. And finally, we have The Seven Moons of Maali, Almeida by Shehan, Karunatilaka, and this book appealed to everything that Charlie likes. It was humorous, discussing death, discussing the bureaucracy of death in an almost Beetlejuice-like fashion, and reminded me of A Christmas Carol in the fact that this man is in the afterlife, but he keeps going back and showing the events that led up to his death and who he was as a person before his eventual demise. And it discussed the afterlife, it discussed possible demons and devilish type characters. It's just really, this is one of those times when I find everything I like packed into a book and struggle to figure out how to verbalise my thoughts, because I so wholeheartedly adored the experience of this book. It is a book that shows us the darker aspects of humanity, because we know that our protagonist has been murdered. We get to see what has happened to his body after death, and it's incredibly grim and disturbing, and the images stuck in my mind long after I had finished reading. I mean, it's been not too long, really. I say long after I finished reading, it's been 2 weeks, and still some images are just there, vivid in my mind, and I can only imagine how awful it would be to be the family members to discover that this had happened to a loved one. But the author here has created a character who we know in his life was not the nicest person in the world, who did not help all of the people he could have done. He was really a war photographer, but he might have still had a few underhanded goings on there. I like the way it talked about queer life and the queer experiences within Sri Lanka at the time, and the injustices that Maali faced because of this, and how that might have led to his eventual demise as well. But there is still almost a murder mystery aspect to this book, because we don't know who killed Maali. We don't know what happened to him. We know there's something to do with photographs. We know that he has his loved ones, and that his death has affected them exponentially. Yet you also know that sometimes he hasn't been the nicest person in the world, and still you feel some sympathy for him. You feel sympathetic to the plight of this person who in death is getting to see the wrongs that they might have committed and has to really measure up everything that they ever did, good or bad. And they only have 7 days before that's it. They've got to go into eternity. And yeah, I really, really liked it. I liked this blend of the dark and the grotesque with the humorous. I liked the mythology that was throughout this book. Like I say, I enjoyed getting to see the bureaucracy after death. I enjoyed the non-linear storyline. I liked the characterization. I thoroughly adored every aspect of this book, and It was at the top of my list, going from the long list into the short list, and it's still there now. So that's all I can say about that one. And them's the books. If you've read any of these books and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you got something out of this video, and until next time, that is all.